discussion on the American Political Science Association's Task Force on Congressional Reform. So the task force met over the course of the last year to study reform issues connected to the Select Committee's mandate and to issue recommendations for improving and modernizing congressional operations. Over the past few weeks, we've heard about some of the recommendations that came out of this process, particularly in the areas of staffing and technology. Today, we'll hear about some additional recommendations on increasing congressional capacity as well as staff diversity. We held a hearing last June on cultivating diversity and improving staff retention. We've continued to focus on this topic ever since. Today, we'll consider how minority representation in Congress affects representation of minority interests. We'll also hear about the task force's process, and I think that will be really valuable. While they were able to reach consensus on recommendations to improve staff retention and diversity and to boost capacity, other topics were very difficult to address. Predictably, issues like the congressional calendar and the appropriate balance of power between leaders and committee chairs and individual members proved challenging. But just because reaching consensus on complicated issues is hard doesn't mean we shouldn't have the hard conversations. We shouldn't throw our hands up in the air and declare defeat before figuring out whether there's at least basic principles we can agree to. And this committee's consistently approached the recommendation making process by first asking a simple question: what problem are we trying to solve? And if we agree that there's a problem, then can we have a conversation about solutions? And sometimes we reach consensus and sometimes we don't, but I think we all learn something in the process, and that's the silver lining, I suppose. Because the more we learn and understand about all sides of the issues we care about, the better able we are to find compromise solutions. So I'm looking forward to hearing about some of those tough conversations that the APSA task force members had. I think we've now broken the record for committees hearing from political scientists. Hopefully today we'll hear whether they were able to agree to sets of principles, if not recommendations. And while principles are not solutions per se, they are the building blocks that eventually get us to solution. I think it's really important to not lose sight of that. So before turning it over to Vice Chair Graves, let me just say that this virtual discussion will be run like the others. After the Vice Chair finishes his remarks, I'll introduce our experts and give them 5 minutes each to share some thoughts. Then we'll move to questions, and members will have 5 minutes each. Just a reminder for folks to mute their lines if they're not speaking, just to ensure that we can hear from our experts, or whoever's asking the questions. So with that, let me turn it over to Vice Chair Graves.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see everyone today. Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, our guests who are with us today, they've been working in tandem with us on so many of the issues that we've explored and we've examined over the last several months. So your perspective on our mandate is certainly unique, especially since you've lived it as we have over the last year and a half. One of those issues that we've all discussed and worked on has been that congressional schedule and calendar, which I think we all agree is in an area in need of great reform throughout the House. I know our colleagues, Mr. Timmons and Mr. Pocan, have set up their own subcommittee to explore this further, and I look forward to that continuing conversation with our guests today. I'm also interested to hear more about the areas that their task force didn't find consensus on, and how we can learn from their discussions to inform the next couple of months of recommendations and reform that we have. Our committee's worked effectively and efficiently to improve the institution so it works better for the American people. So as we're approaching the end of our work and look to leave everything out on the field, we need to hear what you recommended during your process. Our committee has always operated on a bipartisan and a thoughtful basis, and more opportunity to showcase and to identify areas of change in Congress is certainly much appreciated. So we thank you for joining us today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Vice Chair Graves. We're joined today by 3 experts from the APSA Task Force on Congressional Reform. Eric Schickler is a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and served as co-chair of the APSA Task Force on Congressional Reform. He's the author of several award-winning books on legislative politics, which I am confident after hearing about this on C-SPAN, the American people will flock to Amazon to buy such books as Disjointed Pluralism, Filibuster, Obstruction and Lawmaking in the United States Senate, and Investigating the President, Congressional Checks on Presidential Power. His research and teaching interests are in the areas of American politics, Congress, rational choice theory, American political development, and public opinion. Second, Ruth Bloch Rubin is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Her research explores how intra-party divisions drive patterns of lawmaking, institutional development, and party leadership in Congress. Her book, Building the Bloc, traces the organizational development and policy consequences of intra-party factions in Congress over the past century. She is currently working on a new book that examines the strategies congressional leaders adopt to navigate intra-party conflicts. And Michael Minta is an associate professor in political science at the University of Minnesota. He's one of the country's leading experts in the study of the political representation of African American, Latino, and women interests in the United States. His book, Oversight, Representing Black and Latino Interests in Congress, is a valuable guide that scholars, political leaders, and the legal community consult when assessing whether diversity in legislatures improves responsiveness to minority interests. Grateful to all three of you for being with us. Hope we did something for book sales there. And let's kick off with Dr. Schickler. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Kilmer, Vice Chairman Graves, and members of the Select Committee. I'm Professor of Political Science at UC Berkeley and co-chair of the APSA Task Force on Congressional Reform. The task force brought together 35 specialists on Congress, most from academia, but several from organizations in Washington who work on congressional reform. It represented a wide range of views on potential reform, but the common commitment uniting us was the belief that a strong and effective Congress is crucial for American government to function. Now, we structured our work to focus on the areas identified in the Select Committee's charge, forming subcommittees to write memos on each area, with the full task force then deliberating about these memos, deciding which items to include, building off of those reports. So we had subcommittees on congressional capacity, staff diversity and retention, budget and appropriations process, technology and innovation, committee and floor process, and calendar reform. Now, a note about our process is we focused, as you are focusing, first on identifying the key problems in each area. And then we turned to assessing potential solutions to those problems. When there was a general consensus on a proposal, we included as an explicit recommendation with a discussion of the rationale. And I want to first put up this slide with our summarizing major recommendations. I know you've heard from task force members on several of these, and you'll hear more about some of them from Professor Rubin and Professor Minta. So I'll just go over it very briefly. Improving institutional expertise through expanding staff available to members and committees, boosting staff retention through better compensation and professional development opportunities, increasing workplace diversity through data collection, recruitment, and climate reforms, institutionalizing processes to update and capitalize on technology, and then finally, with respect to the budget process, two relatively modest reforms, eliminating floor votes on the debt limit and bringing back some form of earmarks. Now, in other cases, we did not reach a consensus. And in those cases, the report discusses the major proposals and describes what we saw as the main trade-offs and competing considerations. So a major area where we didn't reach a consensus was the calendar. I think it's fair to say we did agree on the problems here, in particular, that Congress doesn't have enough time in session to fulfill its core functions. It's worth noting that the time in session has remained about constant over time on average, but this is during a period where the national challenges facing the nation have really grown considerably. Alongside this, we note fewer bills are being introduced per member and fewer committee and subcommittee meetings have been held in recent decades, which suggest just not enough time to address these challenges. And then a related problem is that the schedule limits opportunities for close relationships and interactions among members. With so many members in Washington for just 3 nights per week, there's a lot of concern that the kinds of relationships, especially those across the aisle that might help find compromises and legislate are being limited. And also we note that travel can wear people down and put hard burdens on families. But our problem here is that really addressing those challenges faces a fundamental trade-off between two main congressional roles. First, the role of lawmaker for the nation as a whole, where you work with other members to do that, and that really requires or has required being in Washington. but secondly, closeness to your constituents and providing, access and representation to the 435 separate constituencies. And that there's a real trade-off here, and any reform is going to involve some benefits on one dimension and costs on the other. We did consider several potential reforms. One is expanding the number of days in session through such mechanisms as shortening the August district work period. We noted the costs in terms of effects on families and ties to the home district, though at least considered whether an enhanced relocation allowance might address some of the former costs, though again, at the potential risk of undermining close ties to the home district. Another idea we talked about, and glad to talk about more, is working longer blocks in Washington, either 2 weeks on or 2 weeks off schedule, or super weeks, as they're called. This would mean less time in transit and might give more time for sustained interactions, though also with some costs in terms of longer stretches from your families and potential upsetting of staff routine. Then finally, we talked about setting aside time in district work periods for subcommittee meetings and hearings. I should note this was pre-pandemic. Congress has clearly moved leaps and bounds toward embracing possibilities of virtual meetings. And I think taking stock of how well these work and the extent to which they can help navigate this representation lawmaking trade-off in a post-pandemic world is something important to focus on. The final point on calendar is, I think, in weighing these trade-offs, a big question for members is really to think about how much better would outcomes be if you got to know each other better in Washington and spent more times there. And I think this is something political scientists, as in some sense outsiders, can only have so much insight into. All right, final slide I want to go over just really briefly, or note briefly, as we talked about committee and floor process. This is another area where there was no consensus, though a lot of discussion, and we considered several reforms that are on this slide and weighed those trade-offs. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to go over these right now, but I'd welcome the chance to discuss these during the Q&A if you do have questions. This is something I've studied quite a bit myself in my own research. For now, though, I just want to thank you for your efforts to strengthen Congress. I've studied and taught about this institution for more than 2 decades, and now more than ever believe the future of American democracy depends on sustaining Congress's capacity to act as a co-equal branch of government. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schickler. Next up, Dr. Rubin. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Well, thank you, Chairman Kilmer and Vice Chairman Graves and members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to highlight some of the APSA Task Force's recommendations to improve congressional capacity. Across a range of issues, there's concern that Congress lacks sufficient expertise to compete on equal footing with the executive branch or outside interests, or engage in meaningful policy innovation. As detailed in the report, the number of staff employed by Congress has declined significantly over the past several decades. At the same time, the challenges of government have only grown. Accordingly, the Subcommittee on Congressional Capacities urged the Select Committee to recommend that the House expand the ranks of its experienced and senior staff. We recognize, of course, that there are many ways to do so and important costs and benefits to weigh. And here I'd like to highlight a couple of approaches and associated trade-offs the Select Committee might consider. First, we recommend boosting the number of committee staff. Because committee staff tend to be more experienced than individual member staff and have incentives to develop policy expertise, an increase in committee staffing would, we think, likely improve overall institutional expertise. This could be achieved by allocating additional staffing resources to committee chairs and ranking minority party members, though the task force and our subcommittee did have reservations that doing so might only entrench partisan divisions and result in considerable turnover whenever majority control shifted. One could also assign additional staff to subcommittees. Devolving greater resources to the subcommittee level would likely give more representatives an opportunity to participate in the policymaking process, which is both a selling point and a virtue in and of itself. But a concern is that by diversifying the venues where policy is developed, one might exacerbate existing coordination challenges within and between committees. A more radical solution for the Select Committee to consider is the hiring of a nonpartisan staff to augment existing committee resources. The idea of creating a kind of professionalized in-house think tank for every committee is not new. As noted in our report, the 1945 Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress considered a similar proposal, though it never gained much traction with committee leaders. Nevertheless, we think it may be worth revisiting, particularly for committees with less partisan jurisdictions. A second recommendation for the Select Committee to consider is reinvesting in support agencies like the Congressional Research Service, Government Accountability Office, Congressional Budget Office, and Office of Legislative Counsel. In their current incarnations, these support agencies serve as clearinghouses for expertise across a range of issues, and their services are equally available to all representatives. For this reason, we think it's probably the safest and likely least controversial way to expand legislative expertise. At the same time, the subcommittee recognized that if inexperienced staff were not aware of or fail to use these support agencies appropriately, investing in them would accomplish relatively little. The task force considered several alternatives to reinvesting in these support agencies, and I'll focus on three very quickly here. One more ambitious approach would be to create a series of smaller support agencies that would develop specialized expertise and serve committees with relevant jurisdictions. We think this would have the advantage of giving members and staff greater freedom to experiment and figure out what works best for their particular issue areas. An even more radical approach would be to create a kind of nonpartisan consulting service. Expert staff would rotate through members' offices or committees on a renewable basis. Unlike CRS or GAO, these consultants could offer specific recommendations to members and potentially even interface with outside interests and constituents if members or committees desired. Yet another option for the Select Committee to consider is directing resources to congressional member organizations, CMOs. Historically, these organizations have often had informal staffing operations, but with rare exception, they tend not to employ staff directly. We think this presents an opportunity for the Select Committee as many members actively participate in these organizations, and they remain critical sites for bipartisan interaction. Like committee think tanks or issue-specific support agencies, helping CMOs to hire staff could help representatives with shared interests study emerging issues and draft high-quality legislation together. The virtue of this model is that because CMOs often have more flexible jurisdictions than committees, the staffing resources allocated to them could be more easily put to new use. In closing, I just want to reiterate that there are many ways to increase the expertise available to members of Congress, and pursuing any of these approaches would be better than doing nothing at all. If the Select Committee prefers to increase the funds available for members to hire additional staff for their own offices or allocate additional staffing resources to party leadership, we believe that would be an important improvement on the status quo. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin, and way to stick the landing with 2 seconds to spare. Next up, Dr. Minta, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Kilmer and Vice Chair Graves and the rest of the Select Committee members for inviting me to this important discussion. My role today is just to give you kind of a broader perspective on the recommendations, or at least a broader perspective on staff diversity and why it matters to Congress, focusing mostly on members per se. And so, you know, the longstanding question is, does diversity in political institutions matter for underrepresented groups? The literature has come far, the academic research has come a long way now, where it's not a question of if diversity matters, whether it's racial, ethnic, or gender diversity. It's a question of when it matters and on what issues does it matter. So issues like racial or ethnic issues, whether it's racial profiling, bilingual education, immigration, do we see some differences there? Does it matter on kind of these non-explicitly racial or ethnic issues such as the economy, health, or the environment? So this is where the research has moved us for the most part. Although early research suggested that it's mostly like political party, that's all that really matters in terms of representing minority interests, that Democrats, minorities usually vote for Democrats, and so that's what you see in terms of political representation. But most of what my research finds is that it's not just partisanship, but diversity can also play. It depends on what type of issue and also the issue areas, the legislative areas. So racial and ethnic diversity can enhance the ability to carry out members to carry out their core functions of lawmaking, oversight, constituency casework, or service. The evidence is pretty clear in terms of racial diversity in committee work. I've done some work in looking at and written a book on it on oversight and found that in terms of members and working on agencies, it's not just how members vote, but also in terms of the oversight of congressional agencies. Are they implementing civil rights policies, social welfare policies? And so you see differences between Black, Latino, and white members in terms of paying attention to the oversight of these issues. Other scholars have looked at bill markups and what gets in a bill, and that matters in terms of racial and ethnic diversity. There's also scholars that have found casework that having a diverse membership can help in terms of helping constituency in their districts, whether it's getting unemployment benefits, that we see that there are some clear differences there, that minority members are more likely to help constituents even when they don't live in their district. Now, again, most members really usually focus on their district, but there's been some research to show that even when a constituent doesn't live in a district, that minority members might be more likely to help those members. We see it in terms of introducing and co-sponsoring legislation, that there are clear differences where minority women legislators are more likely to introduce these bills than non-minority members. And of course, in voting, where it's somewhat mixed, but I think the literature has been pretty clear also that voting matters, that you see clear differences between Black, Latinos, and white members on issues of racial and ethnic issues. Now, if it's more of a kind of a non-racial issue, you don't see as much differences between members and how they respond on these issues. So again, it's a question of not if it matters, it's a question of when it matters. And I think the research has been pretty clear. Of course, staffers play a big role in all of this. Members set the objectives, the goals. They're the CEO of their corporation, and then you have the staff that really do a lot of the work. And so having staff on that are attuned to these issues and doing kind of like the groundwork really makes a big difference in the type of questions they're going to be asked at oversight hearings, the type of background work that you need to do. And so bringing those perspectives to the tables on what questions you should be asking agency members or witnesses that appear before hearings, that staff, having a diversity of staff in a member's office makes a difference. And that's all I have. So thank you for the opportunity to share my work with you.
Thank you. Thanks to all three of our witnesses. And let's roll into questions. Dr. Schickler, you mentioned the issues around schedule and calendar, and that the discussions were held pre-COVID. One of the things that this committee has heard consistently is, part of the problem is there's just not enough time. The average member is on 5.4 committees and subcommittees. And when you add up all of the full days and all of the travel days, there's simply not enough time. And as a consequence, you see members having multiple scheduling conflicts of committee and subcommittee. And I want to make sure I understood what you said at the end of your testimony. So did you look at using technology for subcommittee hearings? I mean, I can see pluses and minuses of doing something like identifying one morning a week during a district work period for subcommittee hearings to be done virtually, even when we're outside of the pandemic. There's pluses and minuses of that, but is that something you all looked at? Did you look at the use of technology in grappling with some of these scheduling conflicts that I think make it much harder for the committees to do their jobs as intended and to have the type of participation that's required?
Yeah. So I think since we did conduct our business pre-pandemic, I think our sense of the possibilities were maybe a little bit more limited. than they should have been. So when it comes to subcommittees, one of the things we did talk about a lot was setting aside time while in Washington where subcommittees would, where the committees wouldn't meet in order to save time, set aside time for subcommittees. And I think the trade-off we, ran into there is, that undercuts the committees and their chairs, and that is a source of potential tensions. And I think as we think about it more in this new virtual sense, I think that the possibility of using the district work periods, this idea of setting aside a limited amount of time for subcommittee hearings that are designated, makes a lot of sense in trying to provide at least a chance for some sustained attention. When you're in Washington, even during a committee hearing, you all know you're pulled in 15 different directions, and have so many obligations. Whereas, if members of a subcommittee knew, okay, this 2-hour block or hour-and-a-half block is when I'm going to have this obligation, I think it makes it easier, perhaps during the district work period, to do that. And I think that the virtual, has shown quite a lot of capacity. Also in terms of bringing in witnesses and experts from across the country, as opposed to bringing them into Washington. I think it expands your set of voices you can hear from as well.
And Dr. Bloch Rubin, you mentioned a few radical proposals in your remarks, hiring nonpartisan committee staff and creating a nonpartisan consulting service where expert staff would rotate through member and committee offices. Can you expand on that a bit? I'm curious whether, which committee staff positions might lend themselves to that, and would these positions be kind of jointly funded by the majority and minority, or would there be a separate pool? And I guess as for the consulting services, would that be like CRS, but in the House rather than in the Library of Congress? And what would the difference be in terms of expertise that those consultants would provide as compared to CRS experts?
Certainly. I think the first, I'll preface my answer with just the comment that I think the subcommittee was most interested in allowing or encouraging the select committee to encourage experimentation. So there wasn't one way we thought this could work. Certainly, one could imagine using a system where majority and minority parties pool resources to hire nonpartisan staff. This is sort of akin to what the Senate does with committee and subcommittee clerks. One could also imagine a separate pool of funding, although this might raise concerns about the nonpartisan staff being too insulated, which members might have reservations about. We imagine that these staffer positions would sort of apply to both committee counsel and professional staff members, thinking that for some committees, they might appreciate using nonpartisan staff for oversight responsibilities, where counsel might be more helpful, and then others might prefer to use them for more policy innovation, where having specific policy expertise would be the advantage. In terms of thinking about how the consulting service would compare to CRS, I think the concern that was raised by the subcommittee was largely that CRS, at least in its current incarnation, is sort of just the facts. In its interactions with members, it produces really exceptional reports, but is less involved in working directly with members or with committees and thinking about specific policy recommendations, or certainly in interacting with outside interests or possibly even constituents. And so the idea in having this consulting service would be that it would essentially be a group of staff, excellent staffers who would come in and work with members or committees as needed, and then move along to the next member office or committee that needed them at the time. And that way, they sort of gives members and committees more flex human resources.
Thanks very much. Next up, Vice Chair Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of our guests for your work over the many months and your presentations today. I'm sort of curious. You've worked much like we have. There's been a lot of great ideas, a lot of creative ideas. A lot of things we've been able to advance and recommend, and some things that we just couldn't reach consensus on. Are there any ideas that you might go back and revisit and thinking through the lens of the old world and the new world? The old world is pre-pandemic, and now here we are in a totally different environment. Are there any ideas that maybe were discarded early on in the new or in the older environment, and that you might think would be good to go back and revisit? And starting maybe with Dr. Minta and Dr. Rubin, and And then Dr. Schickler, if y'all don't mind, if there's a thought on that.
Okay. Some things that we'd revisit. That's a very good question. Eric, Ruth, you would have more to say about this.
Well, if I could jump in and note that one of the practical considerations that the capacity committee had in thinking about increasing staff was just where do you put people? We know that there is not a lot of space on Capitol Hill and offices are hard to come by. And so one of the logistical concerns was where would you put this auxiliary staff? And I think one of the things that the pandemic reveals is just how capable people are from working in a variety of different places. And so Congress could be a lot more creative about just thinking about where to be putting its human resources. And maybe that means we should be thinking more flexibly about whether staffers would travel with members to their districts, even if they're tied as part of this consulting service, or whether they're working with a committee. And some of those things might have changed.
And maybe, I guess the things I would add are, I mean, first, with respect to Chair Kilmer's question as well, I think the question about relying more on virtual hearings, I do think that the pandemic world has suggested that we ought to think more about those possibilities. I guess the other thing I'd say is that what this has done is just give a greater sense for the tremendous uncertainty facing Congress and the country, and the need to try to get folks to think beyond the immediate, okay, this reform will benefit this party or this interest at this moment, and in a sense, think back, well, we're in a period of great uncertainty. Who's going to be in the majority, for example, in some future point, and what the challenges they're going to face are going to be. And so to think institutionally, I think it's very easy to focus on a given reform right now and say, does this help Speaker Pelosi and the Democrats now, or does this help the Republican minority now? And then, but if you step back and think about, well, we don't know who's going to be in the majority, what it's going to look like, what are the problems in 3 years, let's say, and then move from that sort of veil of, you can think of that uncertainty in some sense empowers you to think about, well, what is the right balance of power between committees and party leaders in a more abstract, knowing we're going to have a lot of uncertainty about what problems we're facing in the future and what the context is like.
Great points. And, I've realized a couple of positive unintended consequences through this. One, I feel like I've been more connected and had more access to information or to opinion leaders or those that are working on, say, the crisis. I have been able to be in multiple places at one time, depending on how many devices I can boot up at one time. And that seems to have been a positive as well. But one challenge I think we've grappled with is the committee process that, we've been able to have briefings, let's say hearings maybe, but I think we struggle with the concept of markups and the concept of being in person. Partially the committee's in person, or some members want to be in person, some people don't. Have you been able to work through that any, Dr. Schickler, about the actual markup of creating legislation and modifying it, and any thoughts on that? And then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
That's a great question. I mean, so as a task force, we didn't have a chance to grapple with that in this virtual world, I think. I think there's a real trade-off because of the need for transparency and openness, the ability to have the side conversations one might have when you're here in person, like how you navigate that. I to be honest, I don't think we really have the answers to that at this stage.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thanks, Vice Chair Graves. Next up, Chairperson Lofgren.
Well, thanks very much. And it's been, first, let me thank you for the time and effort you put into this. It's very helpful to hear from the academic world who can crunch data and give us new insights. So I appreciate it. Just thinking about in a way, the center of authority in the Congress. It shifts over time. I was elected in 1994, and at that time, the committee chairmen were all powerful, and I mean they were oblivious to the needs of others. Newt Gingrich centralized authority in the Speaker's office in a way that had not been done in many years. And now I think some of that authority is drifting back to the committees, but it's more centralized with the Speaker than it was pre-1994. And the question is, how can you bring in more members and expertise in a way that's also transparent? And one thought I've had, I belong to some, caucuses and members. Most of the caucuses are just in name only, as you know, but there are some that actually do work. I chair the California Democratic delegation. We all chip in. We have a staffer, but it's not transparent. I mean, we have a state delegation, but the meetings are not public. And the same thing with, I belong to the Progressive Caucus. We don't have public meetings. We have, we work together, and that's a good thing, but it doesn't really promote transparency. And I'm thinking about the role of subcommittees in the committee structure, because right now the committee chairmen control the staffing for everything. And so it really diminishes the authority of the subcommittees. And whether we might look at that, just beefing up different power centers around ideology that's not transparent is not necessarily going to get us where we want to be, I'm thinking. And that perhaps strengthening those subcommittees and giving them hiring authority, or at least veto authority, or sharing the budget authority in some way with the chairman might enhance the committee process, but also in a way that promotes transparency. Do you have any thoughts, any of you, on that?
Sure. Why don't I talk a little about the subcommittees, and then Ruth is an expert on the congressional blocks and would be. This is something. So we did not have a consensus on this balance of power question, but we thought about it a lot, and several of us do have strong views about it, including myself. And I think the real division was over whether too much power has gone into the hands of party leaders versus rank and file members and committees. And I think several of us, myself included, thought that boosting subcommittees through guaranteed staff, being able to hold hearings potentially without the full chair's permission, and reserving some time for subcommittee meetings where they kind of have a monopoly on that time, essentially, could make some sense in giving opportunities for individual members to have more influence, which is something that I think is faded to some extent, and to boost this policy-making capacity. And I would actually say, just real briefly, is that in this balance between centralization and individual members, one helpful thing to think about is, when does it work better? When does it work? There's no perfect balance, but I would actually argue in the 1980s, there was a kind of rough parity where you didn't have the kind of party leaders were effective, but were not seen as dominating, and you had more of a say in the committees and subcommittees. And the question is just how to hold those leaders accountable. But I'm glad to talk more about that. Ruth, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the trade-off between providing opportunities for members to coordinate with each other behind closed doors with the transparency principles, I think, is just like sort of weighing the amount of power that individuals versus party leaders should have is just a challenge. I think one of the concerns that the subcommittee debated is that we know that there are some of these organizations that already, as you noted, employ staff, and that gives them an inherent advantage. And so one idea is sort of akin to Madison's grand design to spread the wealth and encourage more of these organizations to engage in developing their own expertise, might both better inform members and allow them to work collaboratively.
But if I may, did you look at, I mean, there's no way you can have, even if, I think the Republicans now have like 10 staff, New Dems have 5, but you cannot replicate the expertise of all of that, all of the committees of Congress by staffing up these ideology groups. And so really what I see is if you want to empower members, I don't think I'm concerned about, and I'm part of it, I'm not negative about what we've done, but if you really want to empower members, maybe we need to look at the committee structure itself and how that is not functioning as well as it might, rather than creating still more, sort of factions, if you will, to that might be power centers away from the party leadership, but also are not really accountable as a group to the American public, nor transparent in any way. Just a thought. I think my time's up, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Next up, Representative Brooks.
Hello, good to see everyone, and thanks to our witnesses for being here and sharing your thoughts. I want to ask Dr. Minta a question about diverse hires within our staff, within our offices. Often member offices hire candidates with previous either intern experience or ties to the district in some ways, and it's often that our senior staff who are part of that hiring process, they are often the most appealing to those senior staff, particularly if they have a knowledge of the district or have worked for us in the past. But that sometimes and often limits the diversity of the candidates that we bring in. So does the task force have any recommendations on how offices can look to diversify their staff while also limiting the difficulties that come with adding staff members who maybe don't have any congressional experience or don't have any ties to the district? Do you have any recommendations from the task force?
Yes, Congresswoman Brooks, thanks for that question. Yes, the task force looked at staff diversity a lot and looked at the different and many of the challenges that you mentioned. So efforts in terms of getting, reaching out to using some of these congressional legislative service organizations and caucuses to like the Congressional Black Caucus or their foundation, or the Congressional Hispanic Caucus or the foundation, and trying to reach out. They have various internship programs to get those, to advertise positions and to get people into Congress as professional staff to get that experience. So that you can provide that diversity of networks in terms of having people know about what Congress's, what positions are available, and being within that social network. The committee has also suggested in terms, one of the biggest things is not just getting recruiting and finding diverse candidates, but also making the positions, the pay, in terms of a lot of members from racial ethnic backgrounds may not have the ability to work in these positions at the pay. And so the subcommittee has recommended maybe increasing the pay so these groups can stay there, and then in terms of and given the opportunity to move up in the ranks and also make themselves available so members can hire a more diverse staff.
Thank you. Shifting gears a minute, Dr. Rubin, you talked about boosting the resources for CRS, GAO, and CBO. And while most of us love using them, during weeks of a lot of intense policy discussions, these support agencies are overwhelmed, and line members often can't get through and get answers on what a CBO score is or what CRS. It takes forever, quite frankly, to get some of this, some of the information we need. Do you have any recommendation of how much of an increase in resources we might need to commit to these agencies? Did you all talk about those kinds of specifics to get us? And I love that you got other ideas about things like nonpartisan consulting groups and so forth. But if we took the institutions that we all very much trust and believe in, CBO, GAO, and CRS, they don't exactly have the capacity and ability to work very fast. So did you think about what that might look like, or what that would take for us to get them to where they're really most helpful to us?
Well, I know we didn't think in particular budget amounts. That's beyond our pay grade, I would say. Although I think one of the things that was noted is that the funding for these organizations is really flatlined or declined, and that has been a big problem. And certainly in our current climate, we would imagine the kind of questions individuals are going to be asking would multiply exponentially. So whatever amount we might have projected, it would certainly seem like it would be more. I think the fundamental trade-off that the subcommittee debated is both the breakneck speed which with a lot of congressional decision making is made with the kind of time it takes to put together the expert knowledge that members need to rely on. And that's one of the reasons why an additional recommendation that the subcommittee made is to make sure that there are many senior policy experts on hand, and that we try and reduce turnover so that ideally people will have had some experience with some of the issues at any given time and might be able to be better positioned to preview what, for example, a CRS report might say.
Okay, thank you so much. My time's up. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Mr. Cleaver. Sorry, Mr. Cleaver, you may need to unmute yourself. Perhaps we will come back to Mr. Cleaver. I'm just checking my my order. Mr. Pocan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. Very interesting looking at some of the results of your recommendations, on the budget process front. I think getting rid of that extra vote on the debt limit is something I've always thought was kind of silly. You agree to buy a washing machine, but whether or not you put the check in the mail, you've got to decide. Never really made a lot of sense. And bringing some form of earmarks back to have some more member control in the process. Mr. Timmons and I were really actively pursuing some scheduling changes. Unfortunately, our leadership, we had a little conversation with them privately, and it kind of went over like someone relieving gas in an elevator. It wasn't exactly well received, and a lot of nose cringing. And so I had kind of put that as probably not going to happen. However, the COVID crisis has kind of changed things significantly. And we found that things like this work really well, and you can still have that time. I think a lot of us will be out there, not this weekend, but next weekend between Friday votes and Monday votes. The problem is we're not going to be able to get to know each other and interact because we're in the middle of COVID-19. So we'll spend a lot of time in our residences. But the idea of that was something that we really liked, that you'd have 5-day weeks, less time in airports and traveling and more time actually legislating. So, first question would be just to talk a little more about the idea that, the 5-day on, 5-day on with a weekend kind of staying over and getting rid of all that travel. And the second part, I really like the idea and not thought of, because this now works so well doing committee hearings this way on the weeks that we are back home. There's no reason we can't have subcommittee hearings and have them quite effectively with even more witnesses than can come to Washington, D.C., as you all laid out. Can you just address those two questions about that 2-week on, 2-week off aspect and why it quite didn't make it to a full recommendation? And then secondly, a little more, I love the idea of using those weeks to have remote subcommittees.
Sure. I mean, on the first one about why it didn't quite make it, I think that there was so one thing that we heard was in terms of staff routines that, office staff have kind of built their work life and around the current schedule to a certain extent. And so that I don't think that the task force felt fully competent to navigate that and figure out, okay, what is a way that we can reconcile this with the work life of staff, essentially. So I think that kind of caused us to pause, but to still put it in the report as something to seriously consider, because I think, many of us do believe that sustained time in Washington is really important. So, and I just want to emphasize also, we had a pretty high bar to including something as a recommendation. It was essentially a consensus. Nobody in a group of 35 could strongly object to something, essentially. And so that was a pretty high bar. In terms of the subcommittee hearings, yeah, I think that is, there are technical issues that will need to be resolved in terms of, training and experience, but I think members and participants will get that over time. And I just do think it's a really valuable idea, because getting more subcommittee, and even if it's in this remote sense, subcommittee interaction, I think will help improve the policy expertise and capacity of Congress.
Yeah, to that staffing question on the 2 week on, 2 week off, one of the things I think it's always been odd is, generally it's 3 on, right? 1 off, but with this 4-day week, which is either a Monday, Thursday, or a Tuesday, Friday, if the sun is rising on a first moon of, it's our schedule is not really much of a schedule other than what someone threw on paper at some point in the year, and then we make changes from there on it anyway. But you only have 1 week that generally you're back home in district to do all the important stuff that you should do connecting to your district. And then you've got that 3 weeks that all the DC staff are really working more intense, even though they have the 1 day off a week. But, the travel is a killer. I come from a mid-market, Madison, Wisconsin, where I have to fly through somewhere, and it's several times taken me 14 hours to get to DC. I could have drove quicker than flying because of scheduling and other flight issues. So can you just talk about the staffing imbalance of local having you 1 week and DC 3 weeks, and how that 2 and 2 might provide a better balance?
Yeah, I think that the different time paces of the 2 sets of staff, I think, is a real challenge. And I think that the 2 week on, 2 week off, I think with staff being brought, I guess what I would recommend is having staff in the process, actually hearing directly from staff about their experiences with this might help refine this in a way that helps forge a really good balance between the two.
That's another great suggestion. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks very much. Next up, Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the conversation and opportunity to engage. So I didn't have any questions until listening to some of the conversation. I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into some of your thoughts that you're bringing to the table today. One of the things that's I think a goal of a lot of people is, and it's certainly I think the expressed desire, a lot of my constituents and a lot of people around the country, is the idea that Congress needs to learn to work better together, reach across the aisle more often, and increase bipartisanship. We've been working some in this committee about how to accomplish that. How do we increase the level of civility? How do members treat one another? How do we interact? I think all of those things are good things to work on, and I try to do that myself. I think everybody on this committee does as well. And I guess my question is, do you have any suggestions on how we can achieve that elusive goal of the Shangri-La of legislating and working hand in hand on legislation, instead of this partisan dynamic that we always have, and one party always trying to wrestle the majority away from the other party, and which really doesn't always, you can't eliminate that completely, I understand, but how can we better foster what I think most people would agree a way to improve the quality of the legislation that we do pass? That's my first thought. Just to get my second thought out, so that Dr. Minta could be thinking about this as well. I think, I'm fully supportive of diversity. Absolutely, I think it makes us stronger in many different ways. But I think, in a theoretical sense, perhaps I just throw out this question: shouldn't our offices reflect our districts, or does that happen naturally, or is there more work that needs to be done, or should we be hiring to increase diversity just for diversity's sake? I guess, and I hope that sounds. I'm not trying to pick a fight or anything. I'm just trying to raise the question of exactly what is our goal and what should we be basing it on. As you know, every district is different. We all come from different parts of the country, and it seems to me like we ought to reflect that. So just some thoughts there. So two ideas, and I'd be happy to hear what you have to say. So whoever would like to start.
Well, I can go first since the question's relevant. Yes. So yes, that is a interesting choice, right? And so in terms of should we hire diversity just for diversity's sake? No, I mean, obviously the first goal is to find someone who can do the work in terms of the policies and getting members ready to do their jobs of lawmaking and constituency service. But what we're just saying is that when you're thinking about those people to hire, you want to have some type of diversity of perspective. So if you live in, say, a district that is majority white, right? And so you're just like, look, the district should pretty much my staff reflects who's in my district at the district level and also in your Washington office. But our argument is, or I shouldn't say argument, is that Congress, I mean, you deal with policies that affect the whole nation, not just your district. And so you need to have different people bringing perspectives on a nationwide to really help make the policy, provide perspectives that you might not think about in your particular district. So, you may be in a primarily rural district, but, a lot of times members are focusing on issues that deal with urban issues or the things that are happening here in the Twin Cities. I mean, these type of issues come up and members are on these committees to weigh in and say, how do I make sense of what's going on and what is good public policy? And so that's where we think diversity brings in and provides that information that members need in order to make a good informed decision.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I don't know if you want, I could respond briefly, but I know we're out of time.
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, great. So on the question about civility and so on, I mean, I think, we didn't reach a consensus on the question of whether parties are too strong or not in party, but I think one way to think about it is that Congress is at its best if you think of Congress needs to serve multiple purposes for our country, right? It has multiple, there's a partisan policy, there's a representation of different constituencies, there's a checking of the executive branch, and so on. And that I think that if we can get members to think in terms of building a career in Congress, meeting these in other words, not just thinking about their stake in their party's team, but seeing opportunities to legislate and make a contribution through committees, through subcommittees, these other mechanisms as well. I think that at least opens up the possibility to forge these relationships that you're talking about. And I think now it's been so focused on this battle for majority control that I think that shut that out. So thinking creatively about building opportunities, probably within the committee and subcommittee structure for members to see themselves making a contribution, that in the long run helps build relationships and a more kind of constructive kind of environment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's kind of the holy grail around here. Always looking to do better in both areas. So thank you all very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, Mr. Cleaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our guests too for being kind enough to give us a bit of their expertise. I'm still struggling with what we can do to assure a higher level of diversity. You know, I think it's for many people it's unintentional, but you know we haven't solved that problem. I remember once I went to Ike Skelton, who was like my brother. Everybody in Missouri would know I did his wedding, I did his funeral, I did his wife's funeral. I mean, we were. I mean, it's about as close as two men could be, and so I know his heart and his spirit. I walk in his house without even knocking on the door. I could just walk out. So one day I said, Ike, you know, we gotta do better than this. He said, what are you talking about? I said, you don't have any minorities on your staff. And he said, I don't. And it's not like so. Then he said, well, I need to do something. Let me, you know, I've got to get something done. So it's not like he was holding meetings saying, let's not bring in African Americans or I'm antithetical to diversity. It didn't even occur to him. And so I know with some people, maybe it is like, no, that's not where I want to go. But with a lot of people, I'd like to even believe with the majority that, you know, that's what we need to do, have a staff that reflect America, you know, or maybe the congressional district. So can you guys help, you know, you have any ideas on what we can do instead of, I mean, we can't require, but it fits in the whole conversation with civility. I mean, you know, what can we do?
Well, I can jump in, Congressman Cleaver. Yes, so the task force, I mean, we looked at the different ways you can try to promote and get the information out to a diverse group of candidates so they can apply and be part of that professional staff. And so whether it's reaching out to historically Black colleges and universities, Hispanic serving or Latino serving institutions, getting that information out. But I think the biggest issue with this is also just the fact that, we're not encouraging Congress to spend more money, but it seems that with many of these underserved populations, I mean, that is a big barrier. I mean, a lot of students, even if you recruit and tell about these jobs, if they say it's non-paying or low paying, I mean, they're just reluctant to do it. You know, you need to have a job that's going to pay you a living wage. And as you know, Washington, D.C. isn't a cheap place to live. And so it really needs to, something needs to be done to really address that where students or people are interested in these jobs or they're attractive in terms of paying, and then also keeping them in there. Like even when they get the jobs, there are these private sector jobs that are paying a lot more. And so we need to like say, okay, well, instead of just moving from Congress, we need that expertise and we need you to stay in because diversity does matter in terms of moving up the promotion line, whether you want to be a chief of staff or LD. So these things are important. So once you get them in, then you got to do efforts to try to keep them in. And I think pay has a lot to do with that.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Schneider, you have any thoughts on it?
The one thing I would add is that the information your story about Representative Skelton, you know, highlights the importance of getting information out there to the members themselves and to the public about, you know, so one of our recommendations was to improve the collection and dissemination of data on both the compensation and the demographic breakdown of congressional staff to just heighten awareness of, well, what do our staff look like? You know, what does it look like in my office? And others to see that as well, to help, you know, just be aware of what your staff is like. And that might help at least direct attention to when you need it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cleaver. Next up, Representative Timmons.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of our guests for coming and being with us today. I'm going to first talk about the schedule because that's all I talk about. So, first few months in Congress, it was very challenging for me to get everywhere I was supposed to go. My calendar just looked hilarious, and I remember asking my mentor, Vice Chair Graves, "What am I supposed to do? I've got to be in 3 places at once." He said, "Well, if you figure that out, let me know. But otherwise, you just got to pick." So I thought it would be better during COVID, but I've literally had to figure out how to do different AirPods. I'd have one hearing in this ear with a conference call in this ear. And it really my mind is kind of confused. So obviously I've been a big proponent of the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off theory. The basic idea is we need to spend less time traveling and more time. And however we can accomplish that, I'm in favor of, but part of it is more full days and less travel days. But the other part is being efficient with our time when we are working. And I've just been so frustrated with the back and forth to the floor and the lack of predictability with votes or with overlapping committee, obligations. And put on top of that, all the meetings that we have. And when things get backed up in one place, it just has a waterfall effect of adversely affecting the entire schedule. So, Dr. Schickler, you had in your notes 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. What else? How do we accomplish this objective? Because it will decentralize power. Leadership really enjoys us running around, not being able to actually communicate with each other and build meaningful relationships. And that's on both sides of the aisle. So, how do we get this done? How do we spend more time working?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in terms of so one thought that your, description of the job, brought to mind is just, something we didn't directly consider, but the question about expanding the size of Congress, of the House, where, essentially you guys are representing, 800,000 people while, so all of the burdens of that, plus the burdens of legislating and travel, that might, the job itself has grown so much that I think that there is that question, is there, whether that might at least help provide the kind of high quality representation that you want to your constituents while still having time to legislate. So just in terms of leadership, I think ultimately it's a matter of persuading them that their interests are served by members being that ultimately for the party to succeed, they need to actually be producing legislation that is contributing to the public welfare and well-being. And that in turn requires members to have at least some amount of time to engage with the substance of that legislation. And so to try to, I think that, there's a way to be powerful as leaders that's, premised on kind of shutting out the members, but there's another way to think about power in terms of enhancing the capacity of the group to legislate. I can't tell you how to persuade them of that, but I do believe that it's not clear it's in their long-term interest to keep members in this situation.
Well, it's definitely in the country's long-term interest, civility and a good working relationship in Congress. I got one more question for you. One of your slides had in Republican term limits for leaders of committees. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that as well, and I do think it's a problem when only one of the parties have it. So the question is, in a perfect world, you wave a magic wand, is it better for Republicans to remove their term limits, the Democrats to institute term limits?
So our view is that term limits on balance are not good because they hinder the expertise, and the value of that position, that you want to give members the real incentive to invest in becoming experts within their committees. I think the cost of not having term limits is if these chairs are unaccountable and have too much power, and so that's why alongside removing the term limits for the chairs, I personally believe strengthening the subcommittees, giving them guaranteed staff, for example, and chance to hold hearings on their own. That prevents the chairs from becoming all powerful while still preserving the importance of expertise.
As the freshman, I think taking a merit-based approach versus a seniority-based approach is always better. But in about 6 or 8 years, I'll probably think that seniority is more important than merit. So I'll put that where it is. But Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you for this time, and thank you all for being with us.
Thanks, Mr. Timmons. And next up, Representative Scanlon.
Thank you. And thank you for the information you provided. I was just curious, Professor Schickler, you mentioned this idea of expanding Congress, expanding the size of it. And I certainly understand the appeal in terms of having less people to represent so that you can do a better job, a more focused job. But I'm really concerned about having even more people that we have to deal with in DC. It's chaotic enough as it is. Do you have any insights on that end?
It's a great, I mean, there's a sense in which, so first I should preface this is not something the task force made a recommendation on. I think it's a trade. I think that, I think this is another place where there's a real trade-off. And I think the best, an argument against it is that in the end, expanding Congress just will add to the centralization, the incentive to defer to leaders. And make it harder for members to form those relationships. And so I think that is a really good reason for skepticism of it. I think but I do think the trade-off is, the size of the institutions remain constant since, for about a little over 100 years, while the country has grown so much and the problems have grown so much. And so whether there's at least some, I think it's a really hard trade-off. I wouldn't push too hard on one side of it.
Okay, it's something that comes up fairly frequently these days in town halls and questions and stuff. So interesting to have a little more perspective on it. One of the issues, and by the way, I hope you got your check from Representative Timmons, because he has been all in, and I think rightly so, on the 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off idea. But I'm sure having additional support here is good. I've been trying to work on the issue of expanding diversity among our staffs and membership. So just was looking for kind of best recommendations there, how we promote that, practical techniques, and how we promote it when there's some skepticism about whether it's a good idea, or when you run into these other considerations with respect to representation of the community. I know we've struggled with I'm sorry. I may have to create someone. Not family.
I'm concerned. Are you being attacked?
No, someone got released, and we have an excess of Zoom meetings happening right now. I got the short straw. 1 minute. Why don't you go to someone else?
All right, we're gonna put a quick pause on Representative Scanlon.
Okay.
This is gonna make the Zoom hearing greatest hits package, I think. I think we've made it through the group, but I want to invite members who have a second round of questions. If there's issues that didn't get addressed in your first round, I want to give folks that opportunity.
So I was just going to follow up with a diversity question.
Okay, go ahead.
In terms of how we can help show the benefits better to members who may not be as convinced that this is a great way to do or know how to do it. I spent some years on a diversity committee in my old law firm, so got a little more enmeshed in it, and I've certainly heard a lot of the arguments about how it makes for better decision making if you have more seats at the table, but that you do have to extend in some ways to overcome some of the barriers. It's not just enough to say, hey, we've got these great internships if some of the people you're trying to target to get into them can't afford to. So is there anything else you can add, Professor Minta?
Yes, Representative Scanlon. Yes, that's the challenge, right? In terms of figuring out, expanding beyond our existing networks, right? Mm-hmm. So most people on committees or diversity committees, like, yeah, we believe in diversity and we want to do something to help out. But at the end of the day, we usually end up hiring people that kind of think like us and a lot of times look like us, right? Because we feel comfortable. And so it really is incumbent upon like really trying to push and reach and go to these areas where these where these groups are, whether it's a historically Black college and university or whether it's at a Latino serving institution, sending some people there and really showing that this is an opportunity to come in and help out. And for the ones that are skeptic, for your colleagues that are skeptical about this, I mean, I like that, we like to think we know a lot, right? But as you know, members of Congress, you have so many issues to deal with. You have limited time. And so it would be nice if there's an issue that pops up where someone actually from a diverse background, they may know about it and they may have a larger network, or they know what experts to reach out to. And that helps members of Congress make better decisions. So like if you're in a predominantly white district, or if you're in a predominantly rural district, if you have people on your staff that are urban, if you have people on your staff that are Black, or even what's going on right now, like with the Twin Cities, I mean, when you're talking about reforming the police, and I mean, maybe that's not an issue in your district, but now it's being pushed on the national forefront. Now you need someone who has a network and know people that has knowledge in these areas to help members make a better decision. So yeah, so it's about bringing in those perspectives to help solve problems. And I think that's the way you pitch it. Everyone doesn't know everything about a particular issue. And that's why you build a diverse collection of people to help solve those problems better.
So as you're talking, it's occurring to me, so both being intentional about hiring, but then maybe intentional about providing platforms for whether it's diverse experts or helping people who get on your staff to grow and move on to other positions or showcasing their talents is part of the mix.
Yes, I think that all of that's included, because you want to, when you bring in people, again, it's not just bringing, and this is the thing, it's not just bringing in a Black staffer or bringing on a Latino staffer just to bring it out. I mean, there's so many, I mean, you look at all the bills that are introduced in Congress, all the issues that come before your plate. I mean, having someone in there with that type of knowledge, that diverse perspectives, really helps with solving the problems. And so when you're thinking about diversity, you're not thinking about, oh, I just got to look good for my district or look good for the public. You think about it, wow, this country is becoming more diverse. There are a lot of different issues that maybe Congress didn't have to deal with 100 years ago. Now these are issues I have to have someone in this office that can help me gather that information, who's in those social networks, who are in those information networks to help me get all the information I need to help me better.
Well, it's certainly been top of mind. We had our judiciary hearing yesterday on justice in policing. And of course, when we're talking about addressing policing that has disproportionately harmed Black people in this country, you have to have Black perspective. So it's been very much top of mind the last couple of weeks, I think, for all of us. Yeah. So thank you. Appreciate it.
No, thank you for the question.
Thank you, Representative Scanlon. I've never been more relieved to see someone come back into the Zoom. I'm glad you're okay. For what it's worth, we didn't see that all of your fingers were still there. But before we wrap, I don't know if any other members have a question. I guess, Dr. Schickler, I'd just like to get one more sense from you about what you couldn't get consensus on and why.
I mean, I think the biggest area where we couldn't get consensus was this question of balance of power between, parties, committees, and individual members. I think that some of the members, I think most of us thought that there is too much power centralized in party leaders, and that committees and individual members need greater opportunities and a bigger role. But others argued that strong party leadership is necessary today to legislate, just given the inherent polarization we face. And so I think that sort of fundamental agreement was not something we could resolve, even as we could think through what are some of the trade-offs with respect to particular reforms about seniority or committee power and so on. I guess I distinguished that from the calendar, where there was, I would say, milder disagreement. Really, it was much more technical about, well, how do we make this work for staff, for example? Whereas I think when it came to committees versus parties, it spoke to a much deeper, fundamental, sort of question.
Very good. Do any other committee members have any final questions? I'm just trying to scan through. I think I'm seeing entirely heads shaking no. So with that, let me just say thank you to our three terrific guests, Dr. Schickler, Dr. Rubin, and Dr. Minta. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today. I also want to thank our terrific committee staff for putting together such an informative briefing and for helping us navigate the world of technology. I'd like to also thank Mary Gay Scanlon's dog for not eating her. And finally, thanks to everyone for your willingness to keep the committee's work moving forward. So with that, this discussion stands adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.